It began with a sound that seemed to slice through the air like broken glass, Rachel Maddow's scream. The cameras caught it in full, her face twisted with frustration, her voice cracking through the studio lights like an alarm that no one had been prepared to hear. For a split second, time froze. The audience sat in stunned silence. Technicians behind the glass held their breath. Even those scrolling half-distractedly on their phones looked up, rewinding, replaying, trying to understand if they had really heard what they thought they heard. The scream wasn't polished. It wasn't controlled. It was raw, desperate, almost feral, an eruption from someone who had spent a career wrapping herself in the armor of calm authority. And that is what made it so shocking. This was Rachel Maddow, the icon of intellectual poise, the voice that prided itself on clarity and command. But in that moment, all of that shattered. The room seemed to grow colder as the sound reverberated. A journalist in the front row blinked hard, pen paused above notebook. The panelists exchanged nervous glances. Maddow, chest rising and falling, realized too late that the mask had slipped. She had not silenced her opponent. She had not commanded the moment. Instead, she had handed the microphone to something far more dangerous, her own loss of control. Outside those walls, the internet was already stirring. Clips of the scream hit timelines within minutes, captions dripping with disbelief. Did Maddow just lose it on live TV? Unhinged. She snapped. The world of social media, hungry for spectacle, had just been served its feast. Memes sprouted instantly, hashtags lined up like dominoes waiting to fall. But what no one knew, not the stunned audience, not the technicians, not even Maddow herself, was that the scream was only the opening shot. Because across from her sat someone who did not flinch, someone whose calm had become sharper in the face of chaos. Jasmine Crockett had heard every decibel, had felt the heat of Maddow's unraveling, and had chosen silence in that very instant. Silence, not weakness, but strategy. The kind of silence that says, "I'm still here. And when I speak, everything changes." The scream was shocking enough. But it was not the story. It was the spark. The real fire was about to begin. Because what happened after Maddow's voice cracked would ignite a firestorm that no one in America could ignore. The scream did not live in isolation. It belonged to a moment that had already been building for months, perhaps even years, as America's political tension stretched thinner and thinner, like glass ready to crack under the slightest pressure. The debate on that stage wasn't just another exchange of talking points, it was a proxy battle for the very soul of the nation. Immigration, justice, dignity, truth, all of it hovered in the air, coiled tight, waiting for the spark that Maddow's scream had just delivered. The studio lights bore down like interrogators, illuminating not just the faces of the debaters but the stakes of the conversation itself. Viewers at home weren't watching for entertainment. They were watching because the outcome felt personal. To many, it was about whether their stories, their identities, their sacrifices were worth more than a dismissive laugh or a hostile outburst. And to others, it was about whether the old guard, those who had long controlled the narrative, could still hold their ground in a country rapidly changing beneath their feet. Maddow's scream, then, was not simply a noise. It was a rupture. To her critics, it was the sound of arrogance exposed, a mask slipping to reveal the panic beneath. To her supporters, it was a moment of uncharacteristic vulnerability that made them question the strength of the figure they had trusted to carry their arguments. But to Jasmine Crockett, it was something else entirely, an opening. She had walked into that room knowing she was not supposed to dominate the stage. The hierarchy had been written long before the lights flickered on: Maddow, the seasoned voice, the intellectual titan; Crockett, the newer figure, expected to stay within the margins. But when the scream echoed and the silence followed, that hierarchy trembled. For the first time, the power dynamic cracked wide enough for Crockett to step through. The country could feel it too. On social media, the scream became less about the pitch of Maddow's voice and more about the symbolism it carried. Panic versus composure. Arrogance versus dignity. Fear versus confidence. The scream was not just heard, it was felt as a tremor in the ongoing struggle over whose voice would define the American narrative. Crockett sat there in the aftermath, calm as stone, her silence louder than Maddow's outburst. That composure carried weight. It was the posture of someone who had lived through dismissals, interruptions, attempts to erase her presence, and had learned that the greatest strength is not always in the volume of your words, but in the timing of them. Viewers could see it, the patience, the resolve, the quiet storm behind her eyes. And that is why this moment mattered. It was not about one scream. It was about what it revealed, about the imbalance of power, about the shifting tides of confidence, about a country reckoning with who truly holds authority when truth is on trial. The scream was a symptom. The real story was the diagnosis it delivered: panic from the top, resilience from below. Yet even as the nation replayed Maddow's slip in disbelief, they had no idea that Crockett's most powerful response was still waiting in her chest. She hadn't spoken it yet. She hadn't even begun. And when she finally did, her words would land with such force that the scream would be remembered not as the headline, but as the setup. The clash was only beginning, and Crockett hadn't even delivered her most devastating words yet. Amy Coney Barrett's rise to power had been scripted like a legal thriller, the kind where the protagonist believes she is untouchable. To her supporters, she was the embodiment of precision, intellect, and authority, a judge who could summon legal precedent with surgical clarity and carve through dissent with the icy calm of someone who believed she had history on her side. But beneath that carefully curated exterior lay a pattern, one that told a different story, a story of rulings that tilted the scales toward the powerful, a legacy that consistently left the vulnerable standing outside the courthouse doors. From the moment she stepped into the national spotlight, Barrett carried herself as though the robe she wore placed her above reproach. Her confirmation hearings had showcased this posture: the calm, deliberate smile, the carefully measured answers, the insistence that she was not political, even as her record betrayed the unmistakable imprint of ideology. She projected the image of an intellectual warrior, confident that her interpretation of the law was unassailable, untouchable. To many in the country, that calm was not reassuring but chilling. It was the calm of someone so convinced of her righteousness that she no longer saw the human lives affected by her judgments. Her judicial legacy bore this out. Again and again, Barrett sided with institutions over individuals, narrowing the scope of rights while broadening the shield of authority for corporations, political elites, and entrenched powers. Her opinions often read less like the careful balance of justice and more like the meticulous reinforcement of a structure designed to preserve privilege. Each case revealed a pattern: when faced with the vulnerable asking for recognition, Barrett found ways to turn them away. This was the contradiction at her core. She spoke of fairness but delivered rulings that deepened divides. She insisted on impartiality, yet her record revealed a philosophy that consistently aligned with the interests of the few against the needs of the many. And still, she carried herself with the air of someone immune to criticism, dismissing detractors as though their concerns were irrelevant, as though they simply didn't understand the law the way she did. That dismissiveness became her defining trait in moments of confrontation. She didn't shout, she didn't rage, she cut down her opponents with a smile that carried the sting of condescension. It was a weaponized calm, a way of projecting control while leaving those across from her feeling smaller, silenced, erased. This was what made her seem invincible to her supporters and insufferable to her critics. She was, in their eyes, the embodiment of institutional arrogance, the personification of a system that had always told marginalized voices to sit down, be quiet, and accept the rules as written by others. Yet arrogance, history teaches, is never invincible. It often plants the seeds of its own undoing. Barrett's certainty blinded her to the shifting currents around her. She believed the force of her authority would always command obedience. She believed that the image she projected, a scholar above the fray, would protect her from the messiness of human emotion and political firestorms. What she did not see was how brittle that image could become when cracked by the unexpected. That crack appeared the night she faced Jasmine Crockett. The same habits that had carried Barrett through courtrooms and hearings, her condescension, her dismissive calm, her intellectual aloofness, would collide with someone who refused to be minimized. Barrett thought the power of her robe, her resume, and her reputation would silence the younger, less established voice across from her. Instead, it would expose her. Because arrogance, no matter how meticulously disguised in precedent and polish, cannot withstand the weight of truth delivered without fear. And in the moments ahead, Barrett's certainty would meet its match. Her authority, once seen as unshakable, would be shaken. Her dismissal of Crockett would not diminish her opponent but magnify her. The cracks in her persona would widen until the image she had worked so carefully to maintain no longer looked like authority at all, but something weaker, something panicked, something vulnerable. This was the foreshadowing written into every beat of her career: arrogance precedes downfall. And Amy Coney Barrett was about to learn that lesson in real time, under the unforgiving glare of cameras, with a nation watching and waiting for the balance to shift. Jasmine Crockett's story was never written in marble courtrooms or ivory towers. It was written in the rhythm of neighborhoods too often forgotten, in the voices of people who had been told they didn't matter, in the struggles that shaped her into the kind of leader who never forgot where she came from. Long before she walked into Congress or faced down the steely gaze of Judge Amy Coney Barrett, Crockett was forged in the crucible of grassroots battles that taught her what power truly meant, not the power of titles or robes, but the power of standing tall when everything around you tells you to bow. She began as a young woman who understood what it meant to be dismissed. Growing up, she had watched how systems bent against those without wealth, how the law so often spoke in a language designed to exclude rather than protect. Instead of looking away, she leaned in. Law was not her first love, it was her calling, the weapon she picked up for people who had none. She chose the cases others avoided, the tenants evicted without warning, the workers cheated out of wages, the families broken by policies written in indifference. In courtrooms where the odds tilted against her, Crockett's voice carried not just her arguments, but the stories of those who had no seat at the table. Her authenticity became her armor. Unlike so many who polished their identities into palatable shapes for the cameras, Crockett refused to smooth her edges. She spoke in the cadence of her community, wore her history openly, and let her scars show because they were proof of survival. That rawness drew people to her. She was not a politician who had parachuted in with pre-written scripts, she was a neighbor, a sister, a daughter of the struggle. When she spoke, those listening felt their own lives reflected back to them. This reputation for fearless truth-telling followed her into politics. In the halls of Congress, surrounded by centuries of marble and tradition, she did not shrink. Instead, she carried with her the same uncompromising voice that had defended tenants and workers in cramped courtrooms. She became known for her sharpness, her refusal to be bulldozed by louder voices, her ability to turn interruptions into opportunities. When seasoned opponents tried to belittle her, she did not match their volume, she matched them with precision, cutting through their arrogance with words that could not be ignored. Her colleagues often underestimated her, mistaking her youth or her openness as signs of weakness. But time after time, Crockett proved them wrong. She was not playing the game to win applause inside those chambers, she was playing to carry stories out of them. For every debate she entered, for every hearing where she spoke, she understood she was not speaking only for herself. She was carrying the weight of thousands, people who looked like her, lived like her, fought battles just like hers, and who rarely saw themselves represented in those elite spaces. That is why the confrontation with Amy Coney Barrett carried so much weight. It wasn't merely one politician versus one judge. It was the embodiment of two worlds colliding, the polished authority of someone who had always been granted respect, and the earned authority of someone who had clawed her way through dismissals and interruptions to stand on equal ground. Crockett's community ties were not symbolic, they were the root of her resilience. Every late night spent drafting arguments, every dismissal she endured, every headline questioning whether she belonged only deepened her resolve. She knew that the people who sent her forward needed her to fight with clarity and courage. They did not need her to be perfect. They needed her to be real. And real is exactly what she was. Her journey had never been easy, and she never pretended otherwise. That was why people trusted her. When she stood in front of a microphone, there was no doubt that the words were hers, pulled from her own convictions, not from some advisor's safe script. That kind of authenticity was rare in politics, and it was dangerous to anyone who thrived on controlling the narrative. As the cameras focused on her during the clash with Barrett, the weight of her story was invisible to most, but it lived in her posture. This was not the first time she had been underestimated, not the first time someone in power had tried to shut her down. Every interruption, every sneer, every moment of being told to stay in her place had prepared her for this. And unlike so many before her, she did not flinch. Because Crockett knew something Judge Barrett did not: silence can be strategy, and timing is everything. The restraint she showed in those first moments of Maddow's scream, the calm she held as Barrett leaned in with dismissive authority, were not signs of weakness, they were the patience of someone who understood the rhythm of battles. She knew when to absorb. She knew when to strike. Every battle she had fought before led to this exact moment in front of Judge Barrett. And when she finally chose to answer, her words would not belong only to her. They would belong to everyone who had ever been told to be quiet, to wait their turn, to accept less than dignity. That was the weight she carried. And that was the weight that was about to flip the trial on its head. The courtroom had already been humming with nervous energy, but when Judge Amy Coney Barrett leaned forward, her voice cutting across Jasmine Crockett's testimony, the air turned sharp. It wasn't just an interruption, it was a performance. Barrett's tone was clipped, polished, and deliberate, like a seasoned conductor trying to keep her orchestra under control. "Congresswoman Crockett," she interjected, her eyes narrowing slightly, "your interpretation of the constitutional precedent is imaginative at best. But let's be clear, the law is not subject to emotional persuasion." The words landed with the weight of a gavel. Some in the room nodded, others scribbled furiously in their notepads, sensing a headline in the making. Barrett had built her career on moments like this, seizing control, framing the narrative, and forcing opponents to play on her intellectual turf. To her, this was just another case of reigning in what she perceived as political theatrics. But Crockett didn't flinch. Her gaze held steady, her posture unshaken. Instead of rushing to respond, she let the silence stretch, just long enough to make the room lean in. It was a calculated pause, the kind that signals not weakness, but preparation. Barrett, misreading the moment, pressed on. "This is precisely why judicial authority cannot be swayed by populist rhetoric. We must guard against the erosion of legal clarity in favor of soundbites that stir the crowd." She delivered the line with a self-assured half-smile, as if she'd just closed the door on the debate. The courtroom murmured, a low ripple of reaction, half approval, half discomfort. Some reporters scribbled down Barrett's words as though history had just been etched, others glanced at Crockett, waiting to see if she'd buckle. Instead, Crockett finally leaned forward. Her voice, calm but edged with conviction, cut through the room like a steady flame. "Judge Barrett," she began, "with all due respect, what you call populist rhetoric, I call the lived reality of millions of Americans whose rights are directly shaped by the rulings you hand down. To them, these aren't abstractions. They're survival." The effect was immediate. A hush fell across the chamber. For the first time, Barrett's carefully cultivated composure flickered, ever so slightly. Barrett quickly tried to regain ground, raising her chin and retorting with a lecture-like cadence. "Survival is safeguarded by the Constitution, not emotional appeals. If every person with a grievance demanded the law bend to their circumstances, the very foundation of our judiciary would collapse. Stability requires dispassionate adherence." It was textbook Barrett, cold precision, cloaked in authority. She had used this framework countless times before, reducing human pain to abstract legal puzzles. But Crockett wasn't just another opponent on the page, she was flesh, blood, and fire. Crockett's lips curved into the faintest smile, one born not of amusement but of recognition. She had faced dismissive authority her entire life, landlords, bosses, officials, even professors who had tried to box her into silence. Barrett's words were nothing new, they were a familiar script she had been preparing for all along. Stability, Crockett countered, her voice rising slightly now, isn't just about protecting institutions. It's about protecting people. And when those institutions repeatedly fail the same communities, when precedent becomes a shield for injustice, then maybe it's not the people who need correcting, Judge Barrett. Maybe it's the precedent. Gasps erupted. The media gallery practically vibrated as pens scratched harder, cameras clicked in rapid fire, and even a few stifled cheers echoed from the back. The tension was no longer confined to the courtroom, it was spilling outward, transmitted instantly to millions watching online. Barrett, visibly irritated now, attempted to silence the uproar with another lecture. Congresswoman, I must remind you that this is not a rally stage. This is a forum for serious deliberation. If you wish to challenge the Constitution, then by all means, amend it. But don't twist its meaning for political gain. But Crockett was ready. Her eyes locked on Barrett with laser precision, her words steady and deliberate, and if the Constitution is interpreted in ways that strip people of dignity and equality, then whose gain are you really protecting? The people's, or the powerful's? A pin-drop silence followed. Barrett's face tightened. The judge who had entered the room certain of her authority now found herself cornered, not by theatrics, but by truth sharpened into a blade. The energy in the room shifted. Crockett hadn't shouted. She hadn't raised her voice. She had simply flipped the frame, dismantling Barrett's intellectual armor and replacing it with a mirror. Suddenly, Barrett wasn't the arbiter of order, she was the defendant in the court of public opinion. And the crowd knew it. The murmurs swelled into audible astonishment, reporters whispering frantically to editors about the moment that would dominate tomorrow's front pages. The clash had reached its tipping point. Then, in a single breath, Jasmine Crockett leaned forward and delivered the words that would flip the script entirely, not just on Judge Barrett, but on the balance of the entire debate. Cliffhanger. The courtroom had become a pressure chamber. Every exchange, every pause, every glance between Amy Coney Barrett and Jasmine Crockett tightened the air like a rope around the room's throat. Barrett had pressed, dismissed, and tried to reassert her authority. Crockett had stood steady, her voice calm, her shoulders squared, her eyes locked like a soldier refusing to step back. But then, everything slowed. It was in that stillness that Crockett chose her moment. She leaned slightly forward, not out of aggression but out of ownership, her body language quiet yet commanding. Her tone, when she spoke, was deliberate, low but sharp, the kind of cadence that forces even the most distracted ears to tune in. She didn't raise her voice, but somehow it carried farther than Barrett's ever could. Judge Barrett, Crockett began, each syllable pronounced as though it were underlined. You sit here speaking of law as though it exists in a vacuum, untouched by the real lives of real people. But I am here because I represent those people, the ones you dismiss, the ones your rulings harm, the ones who don't have the luxury of abstraction. Gasps whispered across the courtroom like wine through dry leaves. The subtle scoff that had curled across Barrett's lips seconds earlier faltered. Her chin dipped, her eyes narrowed, as though she needed to study Crockett more carefully now. And Crockett didn't stop. You talk of precedent and principle. But when precedent crushes the poor, when principle silences women, when your so-called originalism erases the future for black communities, you call it the Constitution. I call it cruelty with citations. The words cracked through the chamber like thunder. Barrett's posture stiffened. For the first time in the hearing, the judge shifted in her chair, not the subtle, commanding gesture of authority but the small, human fidget of someone caught unprepared. She adjusted her robe, touched her papers, as though anchoring herself to objects could steady what Crockett had just shaken. Rachel Maddow, watching from the press section, covered her mouth. It was the same scream-inducing electricity from earlier, only now transformed into something heavier, something historic. She scribbled furiously into her notebook, eyes darting up with every word, as if she already knew the clip would dominate her opening monologue that night. Crockett's tone sharpened but never cracked. It wasn't rage, it was precision. A blade, not a hammer. You believe the law is neutral because you've never stood on the side where it isn't. You've never been the mother wondering if her vote will be counted, the worker watching her union broken apart, the woman told her body is not her own. Neutrality is a privilege you wear like a robe, but to us, it feels like a noose. The room erupted in an audible intake of breath. Even those who disagreed couldn't deny the gravity. Crockett wasn't sparring anymore, she was testifying, channeling voices the chamber was never built to hear. Barrett attempted to interject, her lips parted, her hand twitched toward the microphone, but Crockett kept her gaze locked forward, unflinching. She wasn't rude, she was immovable. She owned the silence until even Barrett realized interrupting now would only magnify her weakness. For the first time, Amy Coney Barrett did not control the room. Crockett leaned back slightly, letting her words linger. Her expression wasn't smug, wasn't triumphant. It was heavier than that. It was the look of someone carrying centuries of voices into a space that never invited them. And then came the mic drop line. The one that would be clipped, shared, memed, debated, and etched into political history. So you can dismiss me, Judge Barrett. You can dismiss every word I say. But know this, when history writes about this moment, it won't be your gavel they remember. It will be my voice. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was full. Full of gasps, full of unspoken recognition, full of the knowledge that a power shift had just occurred. Barrett's eyes, for a flicker of a second, betrayed her. A twitch in her jaw. A tightening around her eyes. She tried to recover, sat taller, placed her hands neatly, composed her lips into the semblance of indifference. But the room had already seen it. Her aura of untouchable composure had cracked, and Crockett had done it without raising her volume above conversation level. The reporters scribbled. Cameras snapped. Someone coughed nervously, as if to break the unbearable weight of silence. Social media, meanwhile, had already clipped the moment, phones in the gallery recorded it in real time, tweets flashing across timelines before Crockett even finished her thought. Hashtags surged. Within minutes, millions were watching a 12-second clip that distilled years of suppressed voices into one unflinching rebuke. Rachel Maddow's scream from earlier now had context. This was it. This was why she had screamed, not just at a line, but at the recognition that history was bending in front of her. Barrett tried to speak again, this time with forced calm, but the damage was done. Her words sounded defensive, her voice thinner, her cadence uncertain. Crockett had flipped the script entirely, the judge looked like the one on trial, scrambling for justification, while the congresswoman looked like the arbiter of truth. Crockett, meanwhile, remained still. She didn't smirk. She didn't gloat. She simply folded her hands and looked ahead, as though she knew the battle was bigger than her. As though she had just delivered not a personal victory but a collective reckoning. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder, swelling into a low rumble of awe. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others leaned forward, transfixed. The moment was already larger than the walls could contain. And outside, beyond the marble pillars, America was watching. For some, Crockett's words were vindication. For others, they were infuriating. But for everyone, they were undeniable. In a single breath, Jasmine Crockett had altered the gravity of the trial. She had taken Barrett's dominance and stripped it bare, revealing it for what it was, power unchallenged until now. And as the silence finally broke into a flurry of reactions, one truth lingered above all. The trial would never be the same again. The courtroom had barely settled before the moment metastasized into something larger than law, larger than politics, larger than even Judge Amy Coney Barrett's tightly constructed aura of control. What had begun as a hearing was now a cultural rupture, and everyone in the room felt it. Reporters bolted toward the exits as though the very walls were on fire, clutching their notepads and phones, desperate to be the first to capture the soundbite that was already rewriting headlines. Cameramen whispered to each other with electric urgency, replaying Crockett's words on tiny viewfinders, shaking their heads in disbelief at what they had just witnessed. And then it began, the buzz, the chatter, the wildfire. Within minutes, hashtags lit up the digital sphere. Hashtag Crockett clapback trended first, a phrase so sharp it carried the sting of history. Not far behind, hashtag trial turned and hashtag voices unleashed surged, each retweet layering momentum upon momentum. What had been a sterile courtroom exchange was suddenly the heartbeat of a nation, pounding through timelines, TikToks, and late-night group chats. Commentators raced to capture the moment in real time. On cable news, anchors leaned forward with the breathlessness usually reserved for election nights. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, one declared, just redefined what courtroom courage looks like. Another marveled, rarely have we seen such composure translate into such force. This wasn't just a rebuttal, it was an indictment. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Barrett, who had spent years mastering the art of measured silence, now found herself trapped in it. She did not speak, did not issue a rebuttal, did not summon the icy disdain that had carried her through countless hearings. For once, her silence was not strategy, it was exposure. Her stillness screamed louder than words, a vacancy where authority once stood. Crockett's words, by contrast, ricocheted beyond the courtroom like a hymn set loose. They were replayed endlessly, on loop in YouTube clips, stitched into TikTok edits, remixed over hip-hop beats. Activists seized on the soundbite, plastering it across protest signs, digital billboards, and Instagram stories. One viral meme paired Barrett's frozen expression with Crockett's searing rebuke in bold white text, "Dignity doesn't bow to power." Celebrities joined in, adding their voices to the chorus. An Oscar-winning actress tweeted, "Jasmine Crockett just gave us all a masterclass in truth-telling." A Grammy-winning rapper posted a clip with the caption, "This is bigger than politics. This is about respect." The moment had transcended its legal setting, it was now a cultural touchstone, replayed in schools, workplaces, and family dining rooms. But it wasn't just the famous who amplified Crockett's clapback. Ordinary Americans, teachers, nurses, single parents, veterans, flooded the digital square with their own testimonies. "She spoke like she was speaking for me," one teacher wrote. Finally, someone stood up to the arrogance. A mother in Detroit posted a selfie with tears in her eyes, writing, "For the first time in a long time, I feel seen." The shockwaves also penetrated the corridors of power. Law clerks whispered about it in hushed tones. Staffers replayed the video in offices across Capitol Hill, some watching with admiration, others with thinly veiled panic. Congressional aides traded messages late into the night, asking the same question, did we just witness a turning point? And perhaps they had. Because what Crockett unleashed in that instant was not just a personal triumph, it was a rupture in the narrative that had long privileged cold authority over lived truth. Her rebuke peeled back the mask of judicial dominance to reveal its fragility, its reliance on intimidation rather than moral gravity. Barrett's carefully cultivated persona, the unflappable, coldly intellectual judge, now looked brittle in the face of Crockett's grounded defiance. Where Barrett projected distance, Crockett radiated connection. Where Barrett wielded abstraction, Crockett wielded humanity. And in that contrast, the American public made its choice. It was more than just applause for a single moment. It was an awakening, a reminder that institutions could be challenged, that arrogance could falter, that dignity, when spoken plainly and bravely, could still cut through the noise. By dawn, major newspapers carried front-page headlines declaring, "Crockett's clapback heard around the nation." Editorial boards dissected its implications. Was this a shift in generational politics? A sign of new accountability for power? Or simply the rare magic of authenticity triumphing over pretense? What everyone agreed on was this: the trial would never be the same again. Barrett, for all her robes and rulings, had been made mortal in the public eye. Crockett, for all her outsider roots, had become a folk hero. And in living rooms, offices, and classrooms across America, people replayed the clip not just to marvel, but to remember. Because in that one electric exchange, arrogance had been exposed, and dignity had been amplified. The ground had shifted. The echoes would not fade. The dust settled, but the reverberations of that moment refused to fade. Jasmine Crockett had spoken, and in doing so, she reframed the confrontation entirely. What had begun as a clash between a congresswoman and a Supreme Court judge had become a lesson in the enduring power of truth over inherited authority, of dignity over arrogance, and of courage over intimidation. Crockett did not merely rebut Amy Coney Barrett's arguments, she redefined the battlefield. She reminded the nation that authority is not an unassailable shield, it is accountable to the people it serves. Barrett, for all her intellect and poise, had relied on the trappings of power, assuming that a robe and a record could speak louder than lived reality. Crockett's victory was not about volume or theatrics. It was about resonance, the kind that comes from truth delivered without fear. In her final words to the courtroom, Crockett distilled the moral of the moment with clarity and grace, that justice is not abstract, that laws must protect the vulnerable, and that no one, regardless of title or rank, can silence the voices that speak for the common good. Every pause, every deliberate phrasing, carried a weight beyond the immediate trial. It was as though the entire history of silenced voices, those ignored by institutions, dismissed by power, overlooked by tradition, had been gathered into a single, piercing statement. The broader lesson rippled through America. People who had felt marginalized, underestimated, or erased suddenly recognized themselves in Crockett's triumph. Teachers, nurses, immigrants, parents, students, anyone who had been told to be quiet, saw proof that their voices could matter. In America, Crockett's words reminded them, no voice is too small to challenge authority when justice is at stake. It was a truth as old as the Republic and yet as urgent as the morning headlines. This wasn't just Crockett's win. It was a collective victory for anyone who had ever been dismissed, silenced, or overlooked. Each retweet, each share, each whispered recounting of the courtroom exchange became a testament to resilience. Ordinary citizens felt emboldened, activists felt validated, a generation of Americans saw that moral clarity, courage, and composure could prevail over prestige, power, and pretense. The crescendo of that moment was not loud, it was steadfast. Crockett had demonstrated that authority is temporary if it rests solely on arrogance. Truth, once spoken, is eternal. Every eye in the courtroom had witnessed it, every social media post amplified it, every conversation, debate, and discussion that followed carried it forward. The lesson was undeniable, dignity endures where hubris crumbles. Even Amy Coney Barrett, for all her intellect and experience, could not erase the imprint of that encounter. History had recorded the crack in her facade, the moment when her composure faltered in the face of unflinching honesty. And yet, the narrative was not about humiliation. It was about accountability, about the principles that make a society just. Barrett's silence became a backdrop against which Crockett's courage shone brighter, illustrating that the power of one well-placed truth can outlast the weight of centuries of authority. Crockett's story, from her grassroots beginnings to this defining confrontation, reminded America of a fundamental truth, that courage is cultivated through experience, resilience is forged in struggle, and authenticity carries a force no title can command. Her victory was symbolic, yes, but also deeply practical. It signaled to the country that moral conviction matters, that bravery is contagious, and that speaking out against injustice is always worth the risk. As the nation absorbed the moment, a sense of inspiration swept through. People realized that authority is accountable, that courage is powerful, and that dignity is uncompromising. In classrooms, living rooms, and offices, conversations began not about the theatrics of the courtroom, but about the lessons Crockett had embodied. Truth will always outlast arrogance, integrity will always outshine pretense, and the voices of the determined can shape history. By the time the final gavel fell, it was clear, this was not merely a courtroom victory. It was a reaffirmation of values that Americans hold dear: justice, equity, and the unwavering belief that every person has the right to be heard. Crockett had transformed a tense trial into a universal lesson. She had turned a moment of confrontation into a moral beacon. And the message resonated beyond politics: when courage meets truth, the outcome is inevitable. The story closed not with the echo of argument, but with a lasting truth: no matter the power arrayed against it, honesty, dignity, and courage will always endure. Truth always outlasts arrogance. Amy Coney Barrett's attack had seemed calculated, precise, and unassailable. Yet in a single, unforgettable exchange, Jasmine Crockett turned the courtroom upside down. Her words didn't just respond, they dismantled the authority Barrett had relied upon and flipped the trial on its head. The attack failed. The narrative shifted. And the nation watched as dignity outshone arrogance, plain and simple. This wasn't just a moment in a courtroom. It was a moment for everyone who has ever been dismissed, silenced, or underestimated. Crockett's courage reminds us all that standing for truth matters, that speaking for justice matters, and that a voice guided by conviction can overcome even the most imposing power. In America, no matter how small a voice may seem, it can change the course of history when wielded with integrity and fearlessness. If you believe dignity will always defeat arrogance, if you believe that truth spoken boldly can inspire change, then this is your movement. Stand with the truth-tellers. Stand with the courageous. Stand with those who refuse to let fear dictate justice. Subscribe to this channel to follow stories that celebrate bravery, amplify voices that challenge power, and illuminate the moments that matter most. Share this video to ensure Crockett's message reaches everyone who needs it. Comment below to join the conversation, to voice your support, and to affirm that integrity is not negotiable. Together, we witness history. Together, we honor courage. Together, we amplify the voices that demand accountability. And together, we remind the world that no amount of arrogance can silence truth.